Some people think first-class tickets are nothing more than a luxury, but for my dad, that seat meant comfort, peace, and dignity after years of hard work. He had earned every bit of it. The day started like any other travel morning. Sunlight spilling across the runway, passengers dragging their bags through the bustling airport, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mixing in the air. But none of us could have predicted how one entitled woman, who believed the world owed her everything, would try to ruin our day. She stormed onto the plane with oversized sunglasses and an attitude that could cut glass. She spotted my dad's seat, paused, and then, without hesitation, demanded he give it up. Not asked politely, not with a smile, but demanded as though she were a queen and he a servant. My dad, calm and collected, simply told her it was his ticket, his seat, his right. But Karen wasn't used to hearing no. Her voice rose, drawing the attention of everyone in first class. Eyes turned, whispers spread, and the flight attendant rushed over. Karen played the victim, insisting my dad should sit in the back because she deserved the comfort more than he did. That's when things started to unravel, because life has a funny way of humbling those who live entitled. My dad didn't yell, he didn't argue, he didn't even raise his voice. He let reality deliver the lesson, and the look on her face when it finally hit her was unforgettable. What happened next wasn't just embarrassing for her, it was a brutal reality check that silenced the entire cabin and left everyone staring, wide-eyed in stunned silence. The morning air was crisped as we drove to the airport. The golden sunlight slanted across the city, bouncing off car windows and glass towers, painting everything with a glow that felt almost cinematic. My dad, sitting in the passenger seat, looked both tired and excited. He had been working non-stop for months, late nights, early mornings, endless meetings. This trip wasn't just a break, it was his reward to himself. For once he allowed himself comfort, and that comfort came in the form of a first-class ticket. Inside the airport, the usual chaos greeted us. People rushed past, dragging suitcases behind them. Announcements echoed through the speakers, and the smell of strong coffee lingered in the air. My dad moved calmly through it all. He wasn't the type to get flustered. He had the patience of someone who had learned the value of hard work and endurance. We checked in, went through security, and finally reached the gate. The boarding process began, and when they called first-class passengers, my dad straightened his posture. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't showing off. But I knew how much this meant to him. Years of sweat, hours of overtime, sacrifices nobody had seen, they had all led to this small but meaningful reward. He stepped onto the jet bridge, sunlight pouring in through the tall windows, and there was a quiet satisfaction on his face. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was calm and bright. The leather seats gleamed, wide and inviting. My dad found his spot, stowed his bag, and settled down. He gave me a small smile, the kind that told me he was finally letting himself breathe. The cabin filled slowly with other passengers, most of them business travelers. Some were already typing away on laptops, others adjusting their seats with practiced familiarity. And then she appeared. Karen. She entered with a kind of presence that immediately pulled eyes toward her. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, her lips pressed into a thin line as though the world constantly failed to meet her expectations. A large designer bag hung off her arm, swinging carelessly as she strode down the aisle. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught on her jewelry, throwing tiny sparks of light across the cabin. She didn't look around at the other passengers, didn't smile at the flight attendants. It was as though she believed the entire aircraft was her stage, and everyone else was merely background. Her steps slowed as she reached our row. She stopped, she stared, and then, with a sharp inhale, she tilted her head and said loudly enough for several people to hear, "Excuse me, but you're in my seat." The words cut through the quiet cabin. My dad looked up, his calm expression never faltering. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out his boarding pass. He checked the number, then turned it toward her. "This is my seat," he said evenly. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She pushed her sunglasses up, revealing narrowed eyes that glared at him as though he had personally insulted her. "No," she snapped. "That's supposed to be mine." The airline must have made a mistake. Passengers nearby began to glance over, curiosity flickering in their expressions. The man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman 2 rows ahead paused mid-sip of her orange juice. Karen, noticing the attention, straightened her posture and spoke louder, as if building an audience for her performance. "I paid for first class," she declared, "and I will not sit anywhere else. So, sir, you need to move." My dad's patience was admirable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't frown. He simply shook his head. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. My ticket says so." The tension thickened like heavy air before a storm. Karen's face flushed, not from embarrassment but from indignation. She wasn't used to being told no. She leaned closer, lowering her sunglasses again as though to make herself more intimidating. "Listen," she hissed. "I don't know how you got this seat, but I'm telling you right now, I'm not moving until I get what I paid for." From my position just behind, I could feel the eyes of half the cabin on us. Some passengers whispered softly, while others smirked knowingly. It wasn't the first time they had likely witnessed someone entitled trying to bend the rules. but it was the first time they would see my dad's quiet strength. He folded his ticket neatly and placed it back in his jacket. Then he looked her in the eye. His voice, calm and steady, carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Ma'am," he said, "I worked hard for this. I bought this seat. It belongs to me." Karen recoiled slightly, but her pride didn't let her back down. She raised her voice even louder now, gesturing toward him dramatically. "Unbelievable. This is exactly the kind of nonsense I deal with. People taking things they don't deserve while I'm treated unfairly." The flight attendant appeared then, drawn by the rising volume. She approached with professional calm, her smile polite but firm. "Is everything okay here?" she asked. Karen pounced on the opportunity. "Finally. Yes, there's a problem. This man is sitting in my seat. I paid for first class, and he's refusing to move." The attendant glanced at my dad, who simply handed over his ticket. She scanned it, nodded, and said, "Sir, you're in the correct seat." Then she turned to Karen. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" For a moment, Karen hesitated. Her confidence faltered, but only briefly. With a sharp motion, she pulled the slip of paper from her bag and thrust it toward the attendant. The attendant scanned it, her expression unchanged. Then she looked at Karen and said, with absolute certainty, "Ma'am, your seat is in economy. Row 32, seat B." The silence that followed was almost electric. A few passengers stifled laughter. The man across the aisle raised his eyebrows and shook his head. My dad leaned back in his seat, the corners of his mouth twitching with the faintest smile. Karen's face turned crimson. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. The attendant handed her ticket back politely. "Please take your assigned seat," she said. Karen froze for a second, then yanked her bag closer and stomped down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The sound echoed through the cabin as she disappeared toward the back, her pride trailing behind her like a torn flag. My dad adjusted his seatbelt, leaned comfortably against the headrest, and let out a quiet breath. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Reality itself had spoken louder than any words. The sunlight poured through the window beside him, lighting up his calm, proud expression. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to truly relax, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, I couldn't help but feel that this journey had already given him something even more valuable than comfort, a reminder of the dignity that comes from standing your ground, even when the world tries to push you aside. The plane's engines hummed steadily as the cabin crew prepared for takeoff. The bright afternoon sunlight poured through the oval windows, washing the first-class section in a warm glow. My dad sat comfortably in his seat now, shoulders finally relaxing, his fingers loosely resting on the armrest. The small skirmish seemed over, but I knew people like Karen rarely admitted defeat, so she had been escorted to the back. Yes, but the memory of her stomping down the aisle lingered in the minds of every passenger. As the safety demonstration began, I glanced toward the rear of the plane. Even from a distance, I could spot her Karen stuffing her large designer bag into the overhead bin above row 32 with far more force than necessary. She slammed it closed, nearly startling the man beside her. Her sunglasses were perched on top of her head now, her jaw tight with fury. She hated being denied, hated being proven wrong, and the humiliation of it all was written across her face like bold letters. The cabin grew quiet as the plane taxied down the runway. The engines roared, the floor vibrated, and in one smooth surge, we lifted into the sky. The clouds floated below us, puffy and white against the endless blue. First class was serene again. Attendants moved gracefully between the aisles, offering drinks and hot towels. My dad accepted a glass of sparkling water, thanking the attendant with his usual courtesy. But peace never lasts long when someone like Karen is on board. About 15 minutes into the flight, just as passengers were settling in, a sharp, angry voice cut through the calm. "This is unacceptable. I can't sit here." It was Karen, her voice carrying all the way to the front. The hum of conversations died as heads turned. A flight attendant hurried toward the back, her polite composure intact. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught fragments. "Too cramped. I paid good money. Ridiculous service." Karen's hands gestured wildly as she spoke, her voice rising above the steady drone of the engines. She jabbed a finger toward the economy seats as though they were an insult carved out just for her. The attendant tried reasoning, her voice calm, measured, but Karen wasn't listening. She was performing again, for anyone within earshot, maybe hoping her loud protest would win her sympathy. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded at one point, her tone dripping with entitlement. A ripple of laughter spread through nearby passengers, quiet but undeniable. Even at a distance, I saw the flush on her face deepen minutes later. The attendant appeared in first class, her expression professional but slightly weary. She leaned toward another crew member and whispered something before heading back. My dad, sipping his drink, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He wasn't gloating. He simply knew that some people had to learn the hard way. Karen wasn't finished. Not long after, she tried walking up the aisle again. This time she didn't storm but strutted, her chin lifted high, as though she could simply will herself into a better seat. She paused at the divider between economy and first class, her eyes scanning the rows, and then fixed on my dad once more. "This is where I should be sitting," she declared, her voice carrying just enough for several people to hear. She stepped forward, only to be stopped immediately by the attendant. "Ma'am," the attendant said firmly, "please return to your assigned seat." Karen's eyes flashed. "I can't believe you're making me sit back there while people like him," she pointed at my dad, her fingers shaking with fury, "take up space they don't deserve." The audacity of her words sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. My dad didn't flinch. He didn't even look directly at her. He simply leaned back further in his seat, the sunlight highlighting the calm strength in his face. His silence was louder than any response could have been. The attendant's patience thinned. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Please return to your seat now." Karen opened her mouth as if to argue again, but the eyes of the entire first-class section were on her. The weight of those stares was unbearable even for her inflated ego. After a long pause, she spun around, muttering under her breath, and marched back to row 32. The sound of her heels clicking on the aisle floor seemed sharper this time, angrier. The cabin exhaled collectively, tension lifting like a storm cloud drifting away. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks. One even whispered to another, "Unbelievable." My dad simply adjusted his seat and opened a magazine unbothered for the next half hour. The plane remained peaceful. Meals were served in first-class steaming dishes of chicken, fish, and pasta with sides of fresh bread. My dad ate slowly, enjoying each bite, the sunlight still pouring in through the windows. It felt almost normal again, but in the back, the storm brewed. Karen wasn't quiet. She complained about the food, the legroom, the people sitting too close to her. At one point she called the attendant again, demanding to be moved. When the attendant explained politely that no other seats were available, Karen scoffed loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. The breaking point came when turbulence rattled the plane briefly. Trays shook, cups wobbled, and passengers gripped their armrests. Most people stayed calm. It was normal, nothing serious. But Karen shrieked dramatically, clutching her seat and yelling, "This is unsafe. I need to be moved now." The overreaction drew eye rolls from passengers around her. Even the attendants, though professional, looked strained. My dad, on the other hand, simply glanced out his window at the clouds drifting by, his demeanor steady, almost amused, by the time the turbulence passed. Karen had worn herself out with complaints. She sat slumped in her seat, arms crossed, her face tight with frustration. She had demanded comfort, respect, superiority, but instead, she had trapped herself in humiliation. The rest of the cabin adjusted, some returning to their conversations, others to their books or screens. Yet the energy of the plane was different now. Karen had made herself unforgettable, not in the way she wanted, but in the way people would laugh about later. My dad finished his meal, leaned back and closed his eyes. The golden sunlight rested on his face, warm and calm. He had said only a handful of words since boarding, but his silence had carried more power than Karen's endless noise at 30,000 feet. The lesson was already unfolding. Dignity doesn't need to shout, and entitlement always crashes harder when reality delivers the fall. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm. The seatbelt signs were off. The sunlight outside spilled gently across the wings, and the cabin had finally grown quieter after the turbulence. My dad was relaxed, sipping a cup of coffee that the attendant had just refilled, his expression calm and content. It should have been an uneventful stretch of the journey, but with Karen in row 32, peace never stayed for long. At first her complaints were muffled. She muttered about the cheap seats and the unfair treatment, her voice carrying just enough for her neighbors to hear. The woman beside her shifted uncomfortably, and the man on the aisle pressed his headphones deeper into his ears, clearly hoping to block her out. But Karen thrived on attention, and the silence of those around her only seemed to make her voice grow louder. "I shouldn't even be back here," she snapped suddenly, startling a young boy in the row ahead. His mother turned around to shush Karen politely, but Karen only rolled her eyes. "You don't understand. I deserve better than this. First class was supposed to be mine." The words reached the ears of the flight attendant, who had been moving down the aisle with a tray of snacks. She paused, her polite smile strained. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice. Other passengers are trying to rest." Karen's jaw dropped, as though the request itself was an insult. "Lower my voice? Are you kidding me? I have been mistreated since the moment I stepped on this plane, and now you want me to stay quiet about it? Absolutely not." She crossed her arms defiantly, her voice ringing out. By now, more passengers were turning to look. Some shook their heads, others exchanged amused glances, and a few pulled out phones, discreetly recording. The atmosphere had shifted from irritation to a kind of stunned curiosity. What would she do next? The attendant set the snack tray aside and crouched slightly to meet Karen's eye level. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but you purchased an economy ticket. We cannot move you to first class. Those seats are reserved for passengers who paid for them. If you continue disrupting the cabin, we will have no choice but to involve the captain." For a moment, Karen faltered. The word captain seemed to hang in the air like a threat, but instead of backing down, she leaned forward and jabbed a finger in the attendant's direction. "Don't you dare threaten me. I know my rights. I've flown more times than you can count, and I know I deserve better than this treatment." The outburst drew a collective sigh from the nearby passengers. A man a few rows ahead muttered, "Here we go again," while another chuckled under his breath. The boy who had been startled earlier peeked over his seat, wide-eyed, whispering to his mother, "Why is she so mad?" Meanwhile, my dad, still in his first-class seat, turned another page of his magazine. He hadn't looked back once, hadn't even acknowledged the chaos. His quiet composure was the sharpest contrast to Karen's flailing temper. To him, this wasn't a battle worth fighting. The truth was already on his side. Back in economy, Karen escalated. She stood up abruptly, her seatbelt clattering against the armrest. "Everyone here should be on my side," she declared loudly. "Do you all think it's fair that a hard-working woman like me is shoved in the back?" While she pointed down the aisle toward first class, where my dad sat, oblivious gets to sit up there and enjoy himself. All eyes followed her gesture. For the first time, my dad looked up. He didn't react, didn't frown or argue. He simply met her gaze from across the cabin with steady calm, then returned to his coffee. The silent dismissal was more powerful than any insult could have been. Passengers began to laugh softly, not cruelly, but in disbelief at her audacity. One man near Karen shook his head and said, "Lady, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." The words hit her like a slap. Her face flushed bright red, her hands trembling as she pointed at him. "How dare you? You don't know what I've been through. I deserve respect." The flight attendant, now joined by a second crew member, stepped forward. Their voices were firm but polite. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. You must sit down and remain calm, or we will have no choice but to report this as a disturbance." Karen's bravado cracked. Her eyes darted from the attendants to the passengers watching her, to the phones quietly recording. For the first time, she seemed to realize the weight of her actions. Yet her pride wouldn't let her retreat gracefully. She collapsed back into her seat, muttering loudly about injustice and incompetence. But the fire in her voice had dimmed. The tension in the cabin broke as the attendants walked away. Passengers returned to their conversations, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. The boy who had been scared earlier whispered to his mother again. She got in trouble, and this time his mother smiled softly and nodded. In first class, my dad leaned his head against the window, gazing at the clouds drifting by. The sunlight made the world outside glow, endless and peaceful, untouched by the drama inside the plane. He looked almost serene, as though nothing on earth could shake his composure. Karen, however, wasn't done completely. Though quieter now, she continued to mutter under her breath, her pride still raw. She shifted restlessly in her seat, arms crossed, glaring toward the front of the plane as though she could burn holes through the curtain dividing economy from first class. Every so often, she sighed dramatically, hoping someone would still pity her. But no one did. She was no longer the victim in anyone's eyes, just the spectacle. The reality check had begun, slow but steady. Karen had tried to seize power with her voice, but all she had gained was the unwanted spotlight of ridicule. The passengers who once looked at her with curiosity now saw her with pity or worse, irritation. And as the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, one thing was clear. She wasn't in control anymore. She was trapped by her own behavior, a prisoner of the very scene she had created. My dad, calm and unshaken, didn't need to prove anything. The simple truth of his rightful place in first class had spoken louder than her tantrums. And Karen's world, her carefully constructed illusion of superiority, was beginning to crumble in front of everyone. The plane glided smoothly through the bright afternoon sky, the clouds stretching like endless fields of white below us. The air in first class was calm once more, but the echoes of Karen's outburst still lingered in the cabin. Passengers whispered about her, shaking their heads and rolling their eyes. My dad, as usual, looked completely He leaned back in his wide seat, sipping the last of his coffee as though nothing unusual had happened. But everyone else knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her rarely were. For a while, she remained quiet, sulking in row 32 with her arms crossed. Her face was tight, her jaw set, and every few minutes she let out a dramatic sigh loud enough for those around her to hear. The man seated next to her shifted uncomfortably, trying to angle himself away, while the woman on the other side kept glancing toward the attendants as though silently begging for help. Then, as the attendants began rolling carts down the aisle to serve meals in economy, Karen struck again. She waved a hand sharply at the nearest attendant, her tone dripping with disdain. "Excuse me," she said, her voice louder than necessary. "Is this really what you call food? I don't eat this cheap, processed garbage. I want what they're having in first class." She jabbed her finger toward the front of the plane, where plates of pasta, grilled chicken, and fresh salads were being served. The attendant, maintaining her professional smile, replied evenly, "Ma'am, the economy and first class have different meal services. If you'd like, I can offer you our available choices here: chicken with rice or pasta with vegetables." Karen let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look like someone who eats rice out of a plastic tray? I paid good money for this flight. I deserve the same quality as the people up there." Her voice carried once again, and heads turned. Some passengers groaned quietly, others whispered in frustration. The man beside her finally spoke up, his patience gone. "Lady, We all paid for these seats. You're not special. Just take the food or don't, but stop making everyone miserable." Karen gasped as though struck. She turned on him, her eyes blazing. "How dare you speak to me like that? You don't know who I am." The man chuckled darkly. "Oh, I think we all know who you are now." Laughter rippled through the nearby rows. It wasn't cruel, but it was pointed, and it stung. Karen's face burned crimson, and she snapped her gaze toward the attendants again. "This is harassment. I won't sit here another minute." The lead attendant appeared, her posture straighter now, her tone firmer. "Ma'am, you have been disruptive multiple times. I need to remind you that this is an official warning. If your behavior continues, the captain will be notified, and appropriate action will be taken." Karen froze for a moment, stunned into silence by the authority in the attendant's voice. But her pride wouldn't let her back down. She stood abruptly, pushing past the tray table and stepping into the aisle. Her voice rose, shaky but loud. "I demand to speak to the captain. This is unacceptable. I should be treated better than this. Sigh. Don't belong back here with—" She stopped herself, but the insult hung in the air. Everyone knew what she meant. The cabin erupted with groans and whispers. A woman across the aisle shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Another man said louder, "Sit down already. We're sick of it." The attendants blocked Karen from moving further up the aisle. "Ma'am, return to your seat immediately," one instructed firmly. Karen pointed a trembling finger toward the curtain separating economy from first class. "He's the problem," she shouted. "That man up there, he stole my seat. None of this would be happening if he hadn't been selfish." Every head turned toward my dad. For the first time since takeoff, the cabin seemed to expect him to respond. But he didn't. He simply looked up calmly, adjusted his glasses, and then returned to the book he had been reading. The sunlight framed his face, highlighting the calm dignity that no tantrum could rattle. His silence was devastating. It showed everyone on that plane who truly held the power in this situation. And it wasn't Karen. Passengers began to laugh again, this time louder, less restrained. The laughter rolled through the rows like a wave, leaving Karen standing frozen in the aisle, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. She had tried to turn everyone against him, but all she had done was make herself the villain of the flight. The lead attendant stepped closer, her voice now unshakable. "Ma'am, sit down right now, or we will notify the captain and restrain you if necessary." The word restrain seemed to pierce through Karen's pride. She glanced around, realizing every passenger's eyes were on her, some recording, some shaking their heads, some outright laughing. She had no allies, no sympathy, only shame. With a sharp huff, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her seat. She collapsed into it, her body rigid with anger, and yanked the seatbelt across her lap with unnecessary force. The attendants exchanged looks before continuing their service. The atmosphere in the cabin slowly began to ease again. Conversations picked back up, people chuckled about what had just happened, and the man seated beside Karen muttered under his breath. Finally, in first class, my dad turned another page, as if nothing had happened at all, but I noticed the faintest curve at the corner of his lips, the smallest smile. He didn't need to say a word. Karen's meltdown had only proven the truth. He had known from the start, respect isn't demanded through tantrums, it's earned quietly over time. The plane cruised on, the sunlight painting the clouds below in gold and white. The passengers settled in, but the memory of Karen's humiliation lingered. She had wanted to rise above everyone else, but instead, she had sunk deeper into disgrace. And though the flight wasn't over, her reputation certainly was by the time the attendants collected trash and dimmed the lights for passengers to rest. Karen sat stiffly in her seat, staring straight ahead, her pride shattered. No one offered her sympathy. No one came to her defense. She had lost the battle, not against my dad, but against her own entitlement. And though she didn't know it yet, the final lesson, the brutal reality check, was still waiting for her before this flight was through. The hours of the flight ticked by, the hum of the engine steady, the sky outside glowing as the sun drifted lower. The golden light slanted through the windows, washing the cabin in warmth as the plane began its slow descent toward the city. Most passengers had settled into a quiet rhythm, reading, napping, or simply staring out at the endless horizon. But row 32 still carried a heavy tension. Karen hadn't moved for nearly an hour. She sat rigid, arms crossed tightly across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every so often she adjusted her sunglasses, even though the cabin lights had been dimmed. It was clear she was trying to salvage some sense of dignity, but her humiliation hung around her like a heavy cloak. No one spoke to her. No one offered comfort. She had isolated herself completely, trapped in the consequences of her own behavior. Meanwhile, in first class, my dad looked almost serene. He had finished his book, folded it neatly, and rested his head back against the soft seat. The faint smile on his face told me everything. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, argue, or prove anything. The truth had spoken for him, and Karen had destroyed herself without his help. As the captain announced the beginning of the descent, flight attendants moved through the aisles, collecting trash and checking that everyone was buckled in. One attendant paused briefly at Karen's row. "Seatbelt, please, ma'am." Karen's movements were sharp, almost defiant, as she clicked the buckle into place. She didn't say a word. The attendant gave her a firm nod and moved on. The descent grew bumpier as the plane cut through patches of turbulence. Passengers gripped their armrests, but it was nothing serious, just the normal shudder of a landing. Still, Karen gasped loudly with each bump, clutching her seat as if the plane were falling from the sky. A few nearby passengers exchanged exasperated looks, while one muttered under his breath, "Drama never ends." Finally, the plane touched down with a jolt, the tires screeching briefly against the runway before settling into a steady roll. Applause rippled through the cabin, a tradition among some travelers, though this time it felt like a sigh of relief. The ordeal was almost over. As the plane slowed to taxi toward the gate, the attendants gave final reminders. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign is off. Most passengers obeyed without hesitation, but Karen, true to form, unbuckled early and stood up, tugging her bag from the overhead bin. The sharp voice of an attendant cut across the cabin instantly. "Ma'am, sit down immediately." Karen froze. Dozens of eyes were on her again. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue, but then, perhaps realizing her fight was already lost, she sank back into her seat, muttering angrily under her breath. When the seatbelt light finally clicked off, the cabin came alive with the usual rush of passengers grabbing bags and stretching limbs. But this time, something different happened. Instead of pushing to the front or trying to leave first, people around Karen deliberately let her stay stuck in her row. Nobody moved aside for her. Nobody gave her the courtesy of space. She was forced to stand awkwardly, waiting as row after row of passengers stepped into the aisle before her. The humiliation deepened. When she finally reached the front of the plane, a uniformed officer stood just beyond the door, waiting. The attendants had clearly radioed ahead about the disturbance. The officer's presence wasn't hostile, but it was firm. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "we need to have a quick conversation about your behavior during this flight." Karen's mouth fell open. She looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for someone to defend her, but no one spoke. The passengers filed past her quietly, some hiding smiles, others shaking their heads. Even the attendants kept their expressions professional, though their relief was obvious. Karen tried to argue one last time, her voice trembling. "This is ridiculous. I was the one mistreated. I deserve better than this." But the officer cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, you disrupted the safety and comfort of this flight. Please step aside." And just like that, she was escorted away, her protests fading as she disappeared into the terminal. My dad and I walked calmly down the jet bridge, the sunlight streaming in through the tall windows. He carried himself with quiet dignity, no triumph in his face, no arrogance in his stride. To him, there was no need to gloat. Karen had written her own ending. As we entered the terminal, I glanced back one last time. Karen was standing with the officer, still trying to explain herself, but no one was listening anymore. The passengers who had witnessed her tantrums walked past without a glance. She was no longer the center of attention, just another traveler facing the consequences of her choices. My dad adjusted his bag on his shoulder, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he said quietly, "You don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes, the truth fights for you." The words stayed with me. The entire flight had been proof of it. Karen had demanded power, respect, and recognition, but her arrogance had stripped all of it away. My dad had asked for nothing, yet he walked away with the one thing she had lost completely: dignity. As we stepped out into the daylight, the warmth of the sun wrapped around us brighter than ever. The flight was over, but the lesson would last much longer.